I'd now, for the discussion session, I'd like to invite the advisory group to come and take their seats on the stage, please. That's Alan and myself, George Bisacca, please, and Simon Bobak, Marco Ciatti, Ian McClure, Paul Van Down, and Jørgen is already here. Thank you. Yeah, okay, we're there now. I think you know most of the speakers already, so I won't introduce them again. But what we hope to achieve in this session is to cover the key points that you have in your program here, and we will be looking at those in just a moment. But first of all, I thought it would be a very good idea if, in turn, the members of the advisory group and Alan and myself just gave you an extremely brief account of where we personally have come from in the field of panel paintings conservation, or what the situation is within our present institutions, just so that you can identify, if you like, with some of us the way we've had our training, the way we operate in our own museums or institutions, and to make comparisons with what we've done in the past. And perhaps I should kick off just with a very brief account of my background at the National Gallery in London, which I joined in the late 1960s. And at that point, as indeed in museums across the world, the situation was very, very different to the way it is now. It was a very hierarchical place. It had curators, conservators were not even allowed to use the library because they got in the way. And the hierarchy was very, very pronounced. The ones at the very top were called Sir, the ones at the very bottom were called Mr., and the ones in the middle we used each other's Christian names. But the point was that the conservators of paintings were split into two very distinct groups, those that worked on the fronts of pictures and those that worked on the backs. And the workshop in the National Gallery was staffed by craftsmen, very, very expert craftsmen, who only worked on linings and panel work. And it was a system that functioned perfectly well. We, up in the studios upstairs, cleaned and restored pictures. We sent them downstairs to the workshops for their panel work and for their linings. And then we got them back again to finish off the restoration and the revarnishing. And that, I imagine, was the case in very many museums. And in some museums, it's still the case. Now, was that a good system? Well, it functioned. It worked very well. But of course, as the years went by, the conservators became more rounded. More conservators did the work on the whole treatment, and the situation slowly changed. But it has to be said that the National Gallery has still preserved some element of that system, in that we have in the National Gallery in London a specialist in panel paintings conservation who works solely on support work and does not treat the fronts of paintings at all. His name is David Thomas. He's extremely skillful. Many of you will not have heard of him, but he's been working at the National Gallery for nearly 40 years and has done many of the main panel treatments there in the National Gallery. So that sort of system of division of labour still thrives. It still works in some cases, but it will be very interesting when we open up our discussion to see whether that system is still there in other institutions. I'd really like to hand over to some of my colleagues now to say what their background is in panel painting conservation. Perhaps Alan would like to carry on.
Yes, as you'll see from my very brief biography in the your delegate pack, I'm really not quite sure what I am. I'm variously conservation scientist, educator in conservation, and practical conservator. My allegiances, I think, lean very much towards the paintings conservator in me, but vocationally, I think my the educational aspect is that still remains a dominant part of my my being, as it were. I come from a family of teachers, and I feel very much genetically a teacher. And I have been teaching paintings conservation variously around the programs in Britain and once in Norway, and teaching within those programs both theoretical and practical aspects of paintings conservation, at least at an introductory level. And I think one of the things I became very aware of during the course of my teaching, and especially now surrounded by some of the experts in the field, very much being aware of the boundaries and limits of my own knowledge and experience, and particularly practical craft skill. I've done quite a lot of additional things, evening classes and DIY around the house and stuff like that to develop my practical skills, but I've been very aware that they are limited, but still can be used to a significant degree. And I think one of the interesting things that I hope this discussion will move on to is the transition from teaching panel paintings conservation at a general level to the kind of advanced, refined level that we've seen from Ciro, George, and many of the other presenters here today. So I think that issue of what skills, qualities, knowledge discriminates a generalist or the general level of teaching of panel paintings conservation to the very advanced level, and what additional elements of skill and knowledge need to be imparted at that higher level.
Let's start at this end with Ian McClure.
Well, my background is probably... I started as an apprentice working in Glasgow Art Gallery, apprentice to the painting conservator there. The gallery itself had a very efficient air conditioning system which was installed when the gallery was built in 1906, but in fact over the years it ceased to be used in a proper way. And so the gallery had terrible climatic conditions, and in fact, so from the very beginning I was very aware that we had panels that were moving, we had splits developing, and we had to treat panels. And of course, being an apprentice, one got a very wide range of practical experience, and one tacked on the theoretical experience as education as you went along, usually irritating your master, as all good apprentices do. And we were also having to have regard of climate conditions, and so I became very much aware of the interaction between these two elements. I've always been interested in practical work, and as a child I was allowed to have a woodwork shop in the basement of our house, when my parents never seemed to mind that I had saws and hammers and chisels and things like that. And so when I came to the Institute, it was really a series of fortunate events in that the Institute, as it had to earn money to keep going, it had a wide range of clients, including institutions like the National Trust, where country houses would have no climate at all, and also we were being asked to treat a number of panel paintings. And then our connection with the Ebury Street studio, which was then operated by Herbert Lank, who established the Institute, and the staff who worked with him, Simon Bobak, and then Ray Marchant, who came along. And then when Simon took over the studio, when Herbert retired, we had a very much closer relationship in working with panels, and so Ray was able to come up several days a week to work. And the additional side to this was that we also were awarded a Leverhulme Fellowship, and were able to have Al Brewer, who came from Queen's University to follow an internship, and we developed that into a project on how auxiliary supports affected the movement of panel paintings. And this very valuable research, which was supported not only by the Leverhulme but also by the Crest Foundation, which gave us the funds to set up a panel workshop where we could adjust the levels of relative humidity so that we could relax panels that were warped so we could work on them, and having the correct sort of machinery. enabled us to enlarge our experience. And I think as I observed all this happening, I became aware that while I knew myself that the principles of what I wanted to do, I became very aware that there's a level of skill which I simply did not have, and which was very obvious in somebody like Ray and, of course, Al. And so, like Alan, I tried to do various other craft skills, including starting to make musical instruments, where I met Jonathan Woolston, who was at the time teaching an evening class in instrument making. So, and I tell you, if you want to learn about how accurate woodworking can be, just try and make a violin, I say. And so I'm now no longer at the Institute. I'm working at Yale Art Gallery, where we have a very wide selection of panel paintings, generally in rather interesting condition. And one of the things I want to do is to be able to survey what we can do with the collection. Perhaps this will be one place where opportunities for people to come and work on some of these objects will be made available. Thank you.
Yeah, my career with rigid support started as a flower painter on porcelain, but that has nothing to do, of course, with panel paintings. So after a study of art history, I landed in the School of Conservation in Copenhagen, and training under the head Sten Bjarnhof at that time, I think the foundation for an approach called minimal intervention and observing the artworks as kind of archaeological objects as well, was kind of founded. I'm not agreeing on this today, but that is certainly a notion that was taught at the school at that time, and something that you may see in large parts of Scandinavia as still being part of the way that we view also the objects that we are treating. My master project at the School of Conservation was dealing with an interior of a 1620 castle in Copenhagen called Rosenborg Castle, where I had the opportunity of splitting that room apart in order to observe the 75 panels set in an oak paneling in the wall in this historic house that has survived and still is there, unaltered since 1620. And looking at all these panels, trying to understand these small-scale panels, their different makers, the different artists that worked on them, a number of panels being delivered, you could read from the reverse side to different artists or to one group of artists, identifying the panel makers, the carpenters, the woodworkers of the 17th century Antwerp, where the panels come from, and the small marks they have put on the reverse side. The tool marks and all this prompted my sincere interest in understanding panels, also the movement of them. Why were some of these panels in such a terribly bad shape and others in that same assembly in a terribly good shape? Why were the panels that had been treated in the past much worse in shape than those that had been a bit untouched for a time? You could see different treating methods. One panel had a reverse completely covered with a lean oil paint with lead white, scraped into the pores of the wood, and that panel was today concave. But the other part of that same painting, originally a larger painting cut in two, had a thin layer of wax on the reverse and was convex. So they have same piece of wood, same types of wood, are today showing entirely different movement due to the treatment that took place. Also the introduction of wax, colophony, shellac in the reverse side of some of them, and some of the very brief reports stating that this panel was in a good shape, but we are doing this for prophylactic reasons, something that now damaged the paint layer considerably, because you cannot impregnate a wood panel. There will always be unimpregnated wood below the paint surface, and yes, is the reverse more rigid as a buffer than the front layer, that is a cracked paint layer, than the transport of moisture going out through the surface of the painting. That was where the interest in understanding these features, understanding their value as historical objects, but also understanding the movement was formed. And being the leader of one of the ICOM Committee for Conservation working groups on rigid reports that later became panels, paintings, and together with Alan, we were co-chairing one of these working groups for 3 years. That was where I could see that there was a great need still for understanding why we treat, how we carry about, how we transport, how we make microenvironments for the possibility of transporting, because we certainly also want as many people as possible to benefit from the artworks created by great masters in the past.
Yes, I find it a bit of a tricky question because I don't have a background in panel painting conservation. So answer could be just be that I don't have it, but perhaps just to say a few more words. I think it's very important that conservators from different fields have contact and exchange information. The aim that we have is generally the same, to preserve historic objects, although the problems might vary considerably. For instance, between furniture conservation and panel paintings conservation, you could see similarities, but the treatment of an old tapestry and treatment of a panel painting is, of course, very different. But still, I think you can learn from each other. So I think it's important to have contact. And one of my first contacts with picture conservation was when I was working in London and became befriended with Emilia Jackson, who was working in the picture studio of the Royal Collection. And I visited the studio there many times, and through her I met other picture restorers like Anna Sandon, who introduced me in the mid-80s to the Ebury Street studio, where I vividly remember seeing a frame that was developed by Simon and Ray. They were not there, so I didn't meet them at that point, but a frame which was designed to house a warped panel, and I was impressed with that. Mixing with conservators from other fields can also be great fun, and I vividly remember the famous Victoria and Albert parties for conservators. And back in the Netherlands, I became involved in the group of IC Netherlands, where people, not just conservators, but also art historians and scientists were on the same committee. And for a while, I was also on the editorial board of Art Matters, where Jørgen was the chairman. And over the last 6 years, I've been coordinating the design and building of the so-called atelier building in Amsterdam, which houses the conservation studios of the Rijksmuseum, but also the ICN, the Dutch Institute for Cultural Heritage, where they have their laboratories, and also the University of Amsterdam is in the same building with their course for conservation, a master course for conservation and restoration. So when Jørgen Wadum asked me in the beginning of 2008, would you like to join the Panel Paintings Initiative, I was very honored and said yes, and I hope I can make a small contribution to the initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Simon.
I was very fortunate in my choice of father, in that he was an engineer and boat builder. And so my childhood was always working with materials and having a wide choice of tools, and also constructing fairly large yachts, so that by the time I was about 14 or 15, I had a reasonable level of skill, and indeed thought that it was very strange to find out that all other children couldn't weld or use a lathe. I served an informal apprenticeship with a canvas specialist and also a panel specialist. I was introduced to him through two very good restorers in England called David Bull and Robert Shepherd, who still work in Wimbledon. They serendipitously just lived nearby to my parents, and I became fascinated by that, and indeed joined Richard Watkiss and worked with him in what I describe as an informal apprenticeship for about 5 or 6 years, whereupon I founded a private practice and worked on my own, initially in a studio in Wimbledon, but then I worked for Herbert Lank, doing linings and panel work for him. And when he founded the Hamilton Carr Institute, I went there a few times, and when he started the London studio, he asked if I'd care to join him. So I jumped at the opportunity, and I've been working there since 1980. As you heard about Herbert's retirement, I've continued and taken over, as it were, the leadership of the London studio, and value our associationship with the Hamilton Car very highly. And indeed, Ray Marchant joined me about 20 years ago, and has been really a leading figure in pushing forward different panel treatments in England. And we both continue working in private practice for individual clients as well as for public collections and indeed private collections. And we are very pleased to be associated with the panel painting initiative and hope we can contribute as well in some small way.
Thank you. George.
Well,
close to the microphone.
I actually at university I was I studied English literature. I have a degree in English literature, and I had until I think probably my junior year or so. I don't think I ever even took an art course, but the degree in English literature was particularly rigorous, and I needed just a sort of easier course and to fill up my curriculum, and I decided to take Italian as a foreign language just because Middlebury had very good language programs, and somehow I decided to take my junior year in Florence, but primarily to study T.S. Eliot and his relationship to Dante. And but during that academic year, it totally changed my entire life, and the relationship there that I developed with Florence continues to be among the most important things in my life, certainly, and so much so that when I came back to school and then graduated, I announced to my family that I was not going to go to law school and go into practice with my father, but I was somehow going to go back to Florence, and I had absolutely no clue what I was going to do when I got there. I just felt I knew I had to go back there. So I did, and I had been so interested in the whole crafts tradition that was so prevalent everywhere in the city, the kinds of workshops and so that were around, and I was so fascinated by the wood carving, and I used to spend a lot of time in the various carving shops, of which there were many more in 1975, and I ended up somehow apprenticing myself to a wood carver first, and spent an enormous amount of time doing that. And then through that, I was often upset at how things that I would carve were being gilded, and so I started apprentice to a gilder in the afternoons, and then no one was paying me any money to do any of this, so I started leading tour groups, first in Florence and then throughout Italy and then throughout Europe, and I would do these 6-week art history tours for American university students. And after some time I started to feel that my manual skills interest was somehow not enough, and I was going to go back to graduate school for history of architecture, which is what I was most really interested in, still now, I think. And but then I got this idea that a good way to combine manual skills and academic interest would be to go into conservation. So I went to my art history professor, Anna Barzanti, and asked her where would be a good place to learn this. And she said, well, there's a very good studio she said there's the Opificio, but that's a state institution, and you can forget about that. But there's a very good studio in the Palazzo Pitti, where Alfio del Serra and Andrea Rote and Leonetto Tintori worked. And so I incredibly naively marched over there directly with some things I had carved under my arm and just rang the bell, And so I was received in the studio, and by Andrea Rothe, and he took me around and showed me things, and he was very interested to talk about America because he had done his high school there, and but he told me, that these things I had made were rather nice, but that there was no room there. And I said, well, I'll come back again. And he said, no, you don't understand. There's not going to be there's a long line of people waiting to get in here. And I mentioned to him something about, I saw some wedges in the end grain of a panel that was leaning against the wall, and I asked him about that, and he said, that's a good idea. Maybe you'd be interested in specializing in something like that. And I said, I was looking for any way to get in there, and so he said, well, we have these people that come from the Opificio in the afternoons sometimes, but they're not here today. Why don't you come back on Monday and you can talk to them? And this was Renzo Turchi and Gianni Marusic. And so I went back on the Monday, and sure enough, there were Gianni and Renzo in the carpentry room, and I asked for Andrea, and someone went back to get him, and they came back and said, oh, he's in a meeting right now. Why don't you talk to Gianni and Renzo in the meantime? So I did, and I told them that Andrea had said maybe I could work with them, and they were shocked, and they said, well, we'll see. They were looking at each other, and then the person came back from the other room and said, okay, Andrea, we'll see you now. And I went in the other room, and Andrea was walking toward me, and he said, so what did they say? Did you talk to them? And I said, oh yeah, I talked to them. And he said, what did they say? I said, well, it's fine with them. And he said, you're kidding, I can't believe that. I didn't think that they would ever take anyone. So each of them thought that the other one had said yes, and because of that, the following Monday I began training there every day. And so it's kind of a funny sort of accident that by total misunderstanding, that's how I was able to start. But at the time also, it was nearly impossible. There was Umberto Baldini at the Opificio, and he was, I tried as hard as I could to go to the Opificio, but he wanted to block every effort there because that studio was not a state institution, and that became a very difficult thing for me. I would have to find ways to sneak in there, in the afternoon later on, and so on. However, later, both Giorgio Bonsanti and Marco Ciatti and Ciro, of course, have welcomed me into there so much, and it's been a huge part of my life. Every vacation, every spare moment I get, I go there, and all I do on my vacation is go to see them at the Opificio. So that's how I...
Thank you, George. Joyce, I hope you're taking oral history notes here. One of the great careers founded on false pretenses. Marco, please bring us to a conclusion here. But by the way, are there microphones up at the back?
Yeah, no, we've got them down the front.
Good,
yeah.
because when we have our discussion after Marco's words, I want people to fling their arms in the air if they have a point to make. We're going to start the discussion any moment, and I want you to intervene when you can. So if the microphones could be ready for people, then that would be great. But Marco, please.
Thank you. My history. I am an art historian. I studied art history in the university, and then I become, by public concourse, an art historian working for the Ministry of Culture in Italy, starting in 1980, before in the Superintendence of Siena, and then starting in 1984 in the Opificio delle Pietre Dure. Opificio delle Pietre Dure, I don't know if everybody knows exactly what it is, but it's a National Institute for Art Conservation, and it needs always some explanation because the name is strange also for it in Italian language, because Opificio is an ancient word. It means something like manufactory, because the origin, the ancient root, come from the workshop founded by the Grand Duke Ferdinand I of the Medici dynasty in 1588 for the production of objects of art for the Medici's court. So when in 19th century the Tuscany was reunited to the rest of Italy with the reunion, there was no more a court for producing objects of art. So they changed activity, passing from the production to the conservation of the same types of objects, because they had very good craftsmen working there. And today it's one of the two national institutes for art conservation. And we are all working in three different fields. The first, of course, is the conservation works. We produce a lot of conservation projects every year, divided into 11 sections according to the main typologies of objects of art. I mean, mobile paintings, wall paintings, bronzes, marble, mosaics, tapestry, textile. 11 sections, 11 different labs with different restorers and different directors. There is this difference between Italy and your countries, that always, according to the traditional point of view about conservation, the director of the lab and the director of each single work of conservation is always an art historian. Because according to the humanistic tradition, the starting point is the exact understanding of the meaning of the works of art. And the final responsible of each conservation work is still today a functionary of the Soprintendenza, who is normally an art historian. And this can be useful for some aspects, of course, regarding historical, aesthetical choices and so on, but can be also sometimes very dangerous for other aspects, because not all the art historians and curators are so confident with the conservation problems. Now in the Opificio I am responsible for the lab of mobile paintings conservation and many other things, for example, the lab of textiles, and also for the review and other activity. When I was very lucky to find in the Opificio many very excellent and expert restorers with an unbelievable manual skills, and I learned a lot of things from them, talking with them every day, asking a lot, because when I arrived there, I didn't know much about conservation. So I, acting as director, I try to organize the work, to organize projects. This is my old idea that I prefer to work along important projects, short-term projects about masterpiece and so on, and also long-term projects. For example, the heritage of the terrible flood of 1966. We are still working. It is one of the projects during time, because the paintings damaged were around 1,000. So you can understand how it's a very long work. And another, for example, another long-term project is the conservation of very ancient medieval panel paintings of 12th and 13th century, because I think that we have also, from conservation point of view, they are very interesting also for the study of the history of technique, because normally people think that medieval Italian panel technique is the same of Giotto and the one described by Cennini, but it's not true. We understood, for some example, that before Giotto, the artistic technique was very, very different. and is totally unknown. For example, in the crucifix I showed yesterday, the Rosanna crucifix, there are some aspects unbelievable. For example, the use of cherry gum inside with the gesso, no animal glue for the ground layer. And so and many other aspects so different from what everyone thinks about the medieval technique. So, which is the role of an art historian as director of a lab? Is to find projects, to organize the lab, to help people work together well, and to have good instruments, connections, exchange with other institutions. And I think that in this way we developed a lot of new technique. From my personal experience, I would say two things to the young colleagues, especially young colleagues. The first, especially for the curators or art historians, you have to stay as much as possible together with the restorers inside the lab, looking at their work every day, so to understand from an inner point of view what conservation is. Talking, because we have a lot of learn from the experience of people. For example, all I know about panel paintings I learned from Ciro Castelli, which is here in front of me now. And discussing with them, with the restorer, because the exchange of opinions can be very useful for both. Sometimes we found a solution of some difficult case also through discussion of my point of view, his point of view, and so sometime early in the morning we arrived to the final conclusion. The second suggestion for everyone is that the good results I showed yesterday, of any way that if you want to obtain a good result in conservation, one of the important things is the continuous collaboration. Continuous collaboration between the three different professionals, the art historian, the restorer, the scientist. I today think that there must be three different professionals. I don't believe in one mixing figure. You cannot do well three different professions. Because they are too much difficult. You can be a good art historian, a good restorer, but not all in the same time. So the important point is the collaboration, to work together. And this is also an important point to discuss, that one of the points that Wadum explained before. Also for the problem of who is the conservator for the panel painting. The answer of your research that people prefer to have only one restorer, even from the front, even from the back of the painting. I am not really sure. For example, in Florence, in our lab, we have different people, because this is our tradition, because you need so high level of manual skill that it's impossible to be able to do everything normally, of course. Also because the knowledge of the woodworking techniques is so large, and it takes a lot of time. Yeah, but anyway, it's a discussion point.
I think, Marco, that's actually a point that we want to get onto in a moment, the division of labour between highly skilled craftspeople and the more rounded conservator. But let's thank you very much indeed. Alan will lead off a discussion now about areas of research.
Yeah, and just to echo what David said earlier, if you feel the urge to respond, both you in the audience and everyone here on the panel, to pipe up, and we'll make sure the microphones can get to you. I really wanted to kick the proceedings off by perhaps coming back to some of the issues that came up this morning and perhaps didn't get explored as far as possible, to do with research in panel paintings conservation. And there were two things in particular that have struck me from the proceedings of the last 2 days, and perhaps members of the audience have observations to make on these. I think one of the interesting things is the point that Duin Ciatti made yesterday, that there actually hasn't been a lot of research or focused research on panel paintings conservation in the 15 years or so since the last symposium. And that's an interesting thing in itself. But what we have seen are some new insights and discoveries. And for me, the big thing of this last 2 days, one of the issues that I'd like to encourage comment or discussion on is the idea that fatigue, deterioration, fracture of materials of paintings can occur due to repeated small cycles of deformations. I'm so relieved that finally the issue of fatigue is becoming more consciously recognized in studies of the mechanics of conservation of paintings and canvas paintings as well as panels. It's something that I feel has been severely overlooked in past studies of the mechanical properties of paintings. One of the issues that I would like to throw open is this dilemma that we have in mechanical studies between testing new materials and testing old materials that are representative of old paintings. And I think there were still some sort of observations on that. And I think taking into account the issue of fatigue, that the significance of fatigue failure of materials becomes even more apparent for weak, brittle materials. So that's one issue I would like to sort of throw out. The other is the issue of remote sensing of the movement of panels, or the sensing of the movement and stresses experienced by panels in relation primarily to environmental changes, and particularly the issue of how we sense or detect and gauge whether the auxiliary support systems that applied are actually performing in the way that we expect them to do. I have this wonderful vision of the panel paintings conservator of the future having a gouge and a festool router in one hand and an SP electric speckle interferometry system in the other hand. That's my kind of vision for the future. So anyway, it's that issue, and if maybe, George, you might want to lead off on that, on how we go about assessing the performance of our auxiliary systems.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Alan. I think that is exactly what we need to have, is that kind of closer collaboration. I mean, normally the scientists have been performing their research in isolation from the conservators doing the treatments, and the conservators have had little contact also with the scientists. I mean, clearly that's the way we need to go. We need to be able to evaluate how the solutions we've arrived at by empirical understanding, how those systems hold up to scientific testing over time. Absolutely.
I think it's quite interesting that in some fields of conservation, for example, in the research into picture varnishes, that's made a sort of quantum leap. I think when you look at the sort of kind of, as it were, scientific research in conservation in, say, the 1930s and 40s, there was a tendency for conservators to sort of take on projects themselves and often carry out experiments that probably weren't really rigorous enough scientifically. And what has been very interesting, for example, with somebody like René Delery coming in to work on varnishes, you have a very highly qualified chemist who devotes his career to devising and investigating materials that will make a more satisfactory picture varnish. And I just wonder whether the nature of sort of panel conservation is such that that's not likely to happen, or is there any kind of way in which that could actually occur, that sort of development?
And could we imagine that the training institutions that have very skilled teachers that might sometimes be more up to date on the scientific development and scientific research going on could be in a collaborative effort, could link collaborative projects with museums in treatments. So they could be kind of an institute of excellence that would assist and gain from this collaborative project in research, in treatment, for the benefit of the art objects, of course, but also for the benefit of the school, the next generation of conservators, so that the dialogue could start that way through, and involve, of course, hardcore scientists that work in the field of conservation.
I wanted to second that, the involvement of the training programs, and also put in a plea for the training of these wonderful new young people who will come from this initiative, thanks to all of you in the Getty, that part of their assignment, in addition to becoming, I know this is overloading a plate, but in addition to becoming wonderful panel painting structural conservators, that they also have to talk about what they're doing and maybe come to the international training programs. And this can cycle back in that you alert the faculty and students in training to carry out, two different things. One is to aspire to become structural panel painting people, and there are not enough of you to go around. We keep trying to get George to come as much as he can, but as we've heard, he goes to Italy. But what we would love is the ripple effect. If these young people who are trained could make a habit of regularly speaking to the various training programs, and that'll do two things: get more people excited about panel paintings and spur research that can take place in the training programs with the faculty and students who are there.
I'd just like to follow up what Joyce has said by asking a very unfashionable question, and that is how much can panel paintings conservation be taught? How much of it is actually in the natural skills of the individual concerned? And I mean, the people, this is a very broad question and comes back to what Marco was saying earlier on about how he is not sure that you shouldn't have specialists working on panels and specialists working on the fronts of paintings who were entirely separate people. It seems to me that the sort of experts that are represented here today have stupendous skills of their own, and I just wonder how much this can be passed on. And that's a rather iconoclastic question, because it rather questions the whole nature of conservation training. But Ian, you for example, have taught yourself quite a lot of woodworking skills, and I just wonder what your view is of that question.
Well, I think one of the really fundamental things was that I really wanted to go to art school, but my school just had no idea that anybody who had any kind of academic pretensions would want to do this. And so I never was able to do art at school because I was clever enough to do German as a foreign language. And I think one of the problems is that there's this sort of fundamental underappreciation of practical skills. And so, nowadays people are going to university to do sort of hostess studies and, sort of media, things like this. But they, in order to get a degree, whereas in fact if you went to, became a very highly skilled cabinet maker, there ought to be a similar recognition so that you have a status in the community. And I think it was Jørgen was telling me about something in Sweden about a program where this is possible. And I think something like that, you'd then begin to get a different range of people who really want to pursue their goals, who have a tremendous interest in craft techniques, who then could be fed into the profession. And before Jørgen answers, well, perhaps you should say something first, and I'll come back to another point. Yes.
Actually, there's a point for Michael up at the back there. If a microphone could go up there somewhere. Do we have one anywhere near?
Mike, do you want to put your hand up?
The microphone.
Shall I go first? I have a microphone.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Okay.
Hang on.
I'm Jill Whitten from Houston, Texas, and I have a comment and a couple of questions. After working in the scientific research department at the National Gallery in Washington for a couple of years, I know that it's frustrating for practicing conservators when research is done, but that you have to isolate components, that aging studies on very complex mixtures of materials are hard to do. And I'm thinking of Mr. Kozlowski's research and the idea of old and new wood and the gesso, that you have to start somewhere, you have to test a certain component, and that eventually you get all of the information together. I just wanted to point that out because I know in testing varnishes, you always want to see how the varnish reacts with the substrate in the paint, and it's really difficult to set up those kinds of studies. But I wanted to ask about some of these systems that I'll call dot and spring systems that have now been in place for 28 years. If that this is a significant amount of time for natural aging, and has anyone had a chance to go back and survey these paintings that have been, I assume, in both climate-controlled and unclimate-controlled situations to see how they're aging? That's one question. And the how they're performing. And then Mr. Van Duin from the Rijksmuseum, did I hear you say that that in furniture panels that cross-grain supports seem to exhibit improved aging over other types of alignment? And thinking of this in relation to Mr. Monfordini's work that Sue Ann presented this morning, will that be a line of inquiry, the idea of an overall or kind of passive support for panels, thin panels? That's a lot of questions.
Well, I basically wanted, in my lecture, I wanted to show that although wood shrinks mainly in a radial way and not in a longitudinal direction, that there are all these objects, panel paintings as well as furniture, as cabinets, where this has been glued together and stood up the time very well. And I think it would be very interesting to find out how the stresses which must have occurred in the wood were sort of absorbed by these constructions. So that, Ian said that was wondering whether research could be done into panel supports, and I think that would be one possibility to see. And wood is, I think, I don't know if I'm right in saying that wood is probably a more complicated material than varnish, and it would be very good if we understood much more about what happens with wood. And I think it's very important to do these laboratory tests with new materials or perhaps old materials, but also I think it's very important to look at how objects have behaved, and that's something that I also want to show in my lecture, that these objects have sort of withstood time very well, and so that would be a good line of research, I think.
And has anyone had a chance to go back and look at these systems with the springs, the early spring systems? I mean, are they holding up after all this time?
The ones that we saw in George's lecture yesterday, for example.
Well, and the ones that are even older than that, the very first ones from I think the ICR.
Well, the Van der Weyden one is 1990. It looks identical as it did then. The Rubens is 1997. Okay, it's only 11 years, but is the same. Many of the early spring mechanisms devised by the Opificio, I don't think there's any measurable difference. No, I think they're performing quite well.
I think the only other thing perhaps one should look at as well with regard to the performance of all of our supports is if they're sitting happily in a climate-controlled museum, they're going to survive even if they're not very good, because the panel's probably in equilibrium anyway. You've really got to have them, shall we say, being road tested to get a realistic idea of how effective your support is.
Yes, I think there's one thing, going back to talking about research projects. Al Breuer, when he was at the Institute, made a very large number of test panels with auxiliary supports, and we've carefully looked. Well, I'm no longer there, but they're still there, and some of those must be, I can't remember, Al, must be over 20 years old, and it's very interesting to see how some of those have deteriorated.
We have a question at or a comment from the very top, Michael Gallagher, and then we have a comment over here.
And Nickel as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going back a little bit to a comment Ian made, which was about the underappreciation of craft. I think it's unfortunate that somehow in language the idea of craft seems to be exclusive from academic sophistication, which I don't think they are. And I think even within our own profession, there is, I mean, at a couple of conferences lately, I've heard people refer to bench skills, which as almost like a dirty habit, and that if we work hard enough, we can move beyond them. And I think one of the great things I found personally in this couple of days was to see the extraordinary level of skills being put to work in the service of great works of art that are sort of like the Everests of treatment, that if you don't aspire over a lifetime to achieve those skills, those works of art will never get that level of treatment. And I think it's been a terrific first start to the panel initiative to emphasize that and show it.
Thank you. Yes, Diane over here.
Yes, Diane Modestini, the Institute of Fine Arts. I'd like to go back to the training of young conservators to work on panels. I am well aware that working with wood requires a certain perhaps predisposition and knowledge of wood, and it cannot be taught in the traditional 4-year program. However, there is an appalling paucity of panel workers, at least in the United States. And I have been for a very long time concerned about that, since I myself work with the Dispersed Crest Collection, which consists largely of paintings on panel, many of which need work. I would very much like this committee to think about ways to address that problem. There are two of our former students, actually, Suan Chui, who is now here at the Getty, who has, I think, just innately some, very good woodworking skills, and has now sort of begun, and I think with the help of George, collaborating with him, and therefore under his tutelage, to undertake treatments on panel, and I'm sure that she will improve over the years. And then a second conservator who gave the paper here today, Monica Griesbach, who also went through the conservation program, but who, as a paintings major, as did Suan, but who also happened to have worked with wood in the past and to be very gifted at working with wood. And she then, as she did her internship with George, and then she went to Italy and worked with Roberto Buda, and has become an excellent panel restorer, albeit very junior. So I wanted to ask the panel, to in the future to somehow formulate a plan whereby conservators could be trained as panel workers. And I do think at this stage that it's important that someone who works on panels is also knowledgeable, at least in a basic way, about the front of the picture as well.
Thank you, Diane. And indeed, training opportunities are a major part of the panel painting initiative, so that will be addressed as we go forward. If we could bring the microphone here, please.
Karen French from the Walters Art Gallery. I just wanted to speak a little to the idea of trying to work on the backs and the fronts of paintings, because I've been there. I've been lucky enough to work both at the Opificio with Ciro Castelli and at the Metropolitan with George. But as well as the training, there's the employment aspect. And very few places can afford to pay someone to work on just the backs of paintings. And if you work somewhere, like I do, where you then don't do that for years, you feel that the hand skills are going because it's something that you have to keep up the whole time. And so it's also this very difficult balance of being able to keep up all your skills at the same time if you're trying to encompass both things. And I don't know, I wish that this had happened 20 years ago when I was in training to help sort of get more training going. And I wonder how you hope to try to help that aspect of things for students as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jørgen, did you want to perhaps respond to that a little bit in terms of the idea of perhaps more peripatetic or regionally based?
Well, I think that's a really... I mean, obviously that's the way it's got to go. And I think from our experience working with Ray, where Ray would come up and work on a specific project with a specific student who was working on the project. So they really had this one-to-one training, which I think made a huge difference because, in fact, that kind of training can't be done really with more than perhaps 2 people involved in the project.
Hello, I'm Claire Munson-Ryder from New Mexico. It occurs to me that, yes, we do need more collaboration in the conservation of panels. And we also do have a resource in our student and professional community, which you also have on your panel, and that's furniture conservators that are highly skilled people that most of us as paintings conservators, we know furniture conservators. And it seems like a logical, or how can I say, a more immediate possibility to try to set up a network of, first of all, training, in perhaps manufacturing, these devices for securing panels. And then ultimately, I agree, the ideal world, you would want to know the front and back, but at least, I think that furniture conservators and woodworking conservators are very sympathetic toward the philosophies and ethics of conservation. And so that in a way, you've already got a compatibility there. And it seems to me a more logical start than trying to train someone like yourself, who, happens to have an affinity for working in wood and likes the front of pictures. So, I don't know, it seems to me, we live in the age of the internet and we can certainly make a lot of different collaborations and connections. But perhaps starting with training are wood conservators.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mikkel, you have a point? Can we have a microphone at the front? You've got one on, have you?
Thank you. Mikkel Schaff, School of Conservation. I just wanted to add a comment to what you said, David, or the question you put forward of whether a subject like panel painting conservation would fit in training programs at all. I'll not make any conclusions here, but I would just mention something that I usually discuss with my students. The fact that in training programs you are not normally able to gain a lot of experience, and subjects like panel painting conservation and, if I may, actually structural treatment of canvas paintings is neither something very simple that you can just learn after a couple of years. In many cases you'd need some kind of a life after your training program where you gain experience in some specific field, and it are usually compared to, for example, the medical doctor that may have had a 5 or 6 or 8 years training and ending up with a PhD in some sort of basic medical training. But I wouldn't like to have performed heart surgery by somebody who has just finished the bachelor level of the medical school. I would prefer somebody who had been out working for a number of years, gaining the specialism of whatever field it is, say heart surgery. So perhaps one way to look at the things would be that training programs gives a certain kind of groundwork on which you can build on more specialized fields. Thank you.
Keep the microphone a moment, Mikkel, because I actually want to just put another point and that is that I think by their very nature, conservation training programs have to teach methods that are essentially safe. They're sort of risk-averse. They have to teach methods that do not put the objects at risk. And as we know from the history of lining, which is not really what we're here to discuss, but it's an example, some of the most beautiful linings of paintings in the past were also the most dangerous. And they're done by people who could do them, but in the hands of other people they would be enormously risky. So there's that tradition in conservation where people did very dangerous procedures and they worked. Now, perhaps there's been this sort of risk-averse culture has sort of sprung up, where we raise difficult procedures, or we rule out difficult procedures on ethical grounds, whereas in fact we're ruling them out because we can't actually do them. And so I'm being a little bit cynical here, but essentially we might say we don't want to line pictures because on ethical grounds, but actually we don't want to line this picture because we can't actually do it. I'd love your comment on that.
If I can add to that a little bit, following on from both points. This is really speaking from my own experience of teaching at that kind of introductory level, is that I agree entirely with David that the approach was necessarily very conservative, working in a very restricted, usually relatively non-interventional way. But the ethos of my teaching always tended to be presenting the full range of what people do in the field, so that the students would be aware of all the possibilities, with some framework for evaluating the relative strengths and weaknesses of those, to allow them to make their own minds up about, obviously with some kind of qualification, but allowing them to make their own minds up about relative importances and to provide a framework for their own kind of personal post-training development in the field. And I think that kind of accords with what David was saying, is that there is a very different function for that primary level general conservation training. And I think that's I've always seen the kind of specialist high-level advanced stuff very much in the mould that you have. It's that kind of post-primary training, obviously with key skills being brought in right at the very beginning.
Well, I can certainly just agree with you. I'm not really it's certainly in training programs you're not doing all this very, very dangerous stuff, and neither. I mean, there was a reason I put forward when I briefly explained about the interviews we've done with the training programs and trying to set into a perspective how a typical training program is set up nowadays, because just the time frame set up for training programs limits the amount of work you are able to do within a typical training program. So just for that reason, you simply can't let a student try all the different things, and certainly you'll leave out the most difficult ones, and then perhaps just cover that more verbally.
Giorgio, did you have a comment? We have a microphone in the middle, at the front.
Yes. Actually, while it's getting there, I was just going to say that following on from Mikkel, I think the value of internships, is incredibly important. Post-program training.
Giorgio here in the middle, and then
Jonathan
yes. At the back there after that.
I was precisely just a little time ago praising David Bomford for his article on changed perspectives in the conservation of paintings. Coming to what you said, I think that in order to do the minimum, you must be able to do the maximum, because only this allows you to understand fully the evaluation of what we are able to do. Let me make a comparison with mural painting conservation. One does not detach mural paintings almost anymore, But in order to be a good conservator of mural paintings, you must be able to do that. And this can be extended to panel or linen or canvas painting and all this. So let's foresee a training which is as full and as complete as possible, because only this will allow you to find the perfect balance of the so-called minimum intervention, which is minimum not because you don't do anything, but because you only do what is specifically to the point. And in order to understand this, you must be very, very skilled.
I agree with that entirely, Giorgio. I always remember the words of that famous philosopher Clint Eastwood in one of the spaghetti western films. I forget which one, it's Fistful of Dollars or something like that, where a man's got to know his own limitations. And I think that somewhere between those two perspectives is the reality, and particularly the difference between introductory or primary level training in conservation and advanced level training.
Jonathan at the back.
Yeah, Jonathan Woolston. I was thinking that maybe
hold the microphone as close as possible.
Sorry, maybe the institutions for panel painting, where learning is taking place, there should be maybe an expert there who can teach basic woodwork and go further as part of the education program. Because I think one thing that a lot of people I've come across, they think that they can't make things because basically as they grew up there, the shed at the bottom of the garden just had a load of rusty old tools that they never could do anything with anyway. And I think part of the problem with people not knowing how to achieve the goal of even just plating a piece of wood is the fact that no one's actually shown them how to sharpen a plane or something. And I've met many people who never thought they could make a violin, or were too old, or thought they were too old, or maybe they thought, well, I'm a girl, I'll never be able to do anything with chisels and things. Is simply not true, because if you show them the correct techniques, they are then enabled to approach wood in the right way, but also then, if they're really interested, they can then they're enabled to take it further. And I think that's, I think it's a very important point. And I don't think necessarily they have to be taught by someone who works on the front or the back of panels necessarily, although that would be great. But I think just a basic woodworking ethic is something that would only arm the student for things that they might come across later on in their careers.
In your own case, Jonathan, I mean, you started off as a violin maker, and obviously developed restoration and repair of violins, which I guess is a slightly different skill to making them, because you actually have to deal with the finished object and invent techniques for very difficult access to the insides of violins. How did your training actually develop from making to restoring and conserving musical instruments?
Well, I mean, after I studied at art school, I apprenticed as a guitar maker because I was very interested in fine woodwork and musical instruments because I played an instrument. And from there I went on to violin making school. And then my thoughts went to getting access to, just to observe great instruments, but also the restoration techniques that were involved. So I then went on to work for various ateliers in North America to learn about restoration techniques and what was going on. But I was, I trained as a violin maker, so I was able to take on board the finer aspects of restoration, working with wood and replacing wood and all the rest of it. But basically, it only comes from a basic woodworking skill and being able to use tools in the correct manner, and
I wonder if I could ask Jonathan a question in return, and that is, if we're talking about basic skills in woodworking, how long does it take, and therefore what are we looking at realistically to tell people? A year, 2 years, solid woodworking?
Well, I don't think it takes quite as long as that, because the thing is, it occurs to me that a lot of, quite a few people would have trouble planing a piece of wood square. And the thing is, I'm sure in panel restoration, as in anything that we do, that's just one useful thing to have on board, and if it's a start, if you can plane something square, you then can plane something tapered quite accurately, but only if you know how to do that. And, as a child, I can remember reading in books, woodworking books, at the procedures to do all this, and it's very difficult to pick that sort of thing up from a book, but it's very easy to show somebody. And once shown, if you show someone to plane a piece of wood with a very sharp, well, you show them how to sharpen the instrument first, you show them how to sharpen and then plane the wood. The next time they come to that plane, if it's blunt, they'll know there's something wrong, and they'll sharpen the plane, and then that will enable them to plane the piece of wood. The trouble is, though, that I think with machinery, there's this false sense of security. I think machinery is great, and I have been trained in the use of it. But I think there's this false sense of security that the edge from a machine is a really good, is the benchmark of excellence, when really it's the edge tool that leaves the best mark, and that should be the benchmark. I'm not saying, George, that the router machine is not leaving a good surface, because I know it's the best thing, and I probably would have trouble.
I understand. I put in several kilometers of hand cut ones as well, but you just can't get one as narrow as that by hand with that kind of accuracy.
I appreciate that
the tool won't
dilemma.
fit in there. So.
But George,
I'm sorry, but I just also feel that I have a certain wariness about an overly academic structure to certain kinds of training like this, because I think that there's a problem where in the graduate postgraduate programs that there's because people are coming out of academic structures. First of all, if you get into a program, you're going through it. You're coming out the other side, and whether you've shown any aptitude or not, you're coming out the other side, and you're a restorer. And that pretty much is going to happen, and I feel that there's an expectance of a kind of linear method, a chronology, a sort of a way of learning a thing that I'm mistrustful of. I think that as Ian said earlier, also the idea of internship. I've understood, at least for myself, that it takes an enormous burden off of me to teach, because if I have someone as an intern who's with me 8 hours a day, that's considerably different, because I can go about what I'm needing to do, and every level of thing happens simultaneously, whether it's the tiniest little observation about how to do a little thing better, or whether it's a philosophical, theoretical consideration or something. It all happens all at the same time, all day long. And it's I feel it's the most organic way of understanding a thing. And I find it a little bit absent when you're going into the classroom and then you're going into the other classroom. And
yeah, well done, George. You've got lots of hands up.
Yeah. Diane was probably first.
Joyce and Diane over here.
Well, speaking for one program, we have removed a number of people for both the academic and the hand skills way. But reflecting back, if I might, on some history of attitudes toward training, here at the Getty, in many years past, there was a wonderful ongoing argument between Norman Bromell and Gaël de Guichen about whether conservation could be in fact taught, the many skills that cannot be taught, versus Gael, who felt that nearly anything could be codified into a classroom presentation. And it was always a great treat to be at a meeting with the two of them and watch them debate this quite hotly. And there is no answer. They're both right. And what we generally talk about among various groups that have been assembled, again, thank you to the Getty who have put us together in little retreats in the past, from programs from Italy to California, to discuss these things, is roughly, we say maybe 7 years, that you have to do possibly a 2 or 3 or 4 year program in the middle, but you probably, for instance, for our furniture conservation, you now have to have at least 2 or 3 years where you've been carving dovetails and doing all kinds of marquetry and whatnot before you can even be considered for the academic part. So I think there are lots of people struggling with this issue, but generally speaking, you've got the apprenticeship portion usually, in our case, before, and then, of course, there are the 3 years of academic, and you don't always get through. You don't always come out the other end. But when you come out the other end, like Mikkel with the heart surgeon who is undertrained, we expect you will go on an internship, a residency, and if you didn't do enough apprenticeship before you went into the program, you'll do it on the other end. So it probably does add up to about 7 years, at least.
Yeah, Diane behind.
I'm going to speak for the Conservation Center of the Institute of Fine Arts. We also have had people wash out. We don't, if they don't appear to have any aptitude for this field, they don't make it through the program. It's very hard to make it through the program. I might also add that, and this is this discussion about the conservator being, the hands-on, bench tool person, as opposed to the art historian, is also, I think, an issue that needs to be discussed. Our students, as I think many of you know, also receive a master's degree in art history, and also when they finish the program, which our program, because of the MA in art history, is a 3-year program plus the internship. The internship is only the beginning. I hate these analogies with medicine because I don't really think they're very apt. However, it is true that once they receive their degree after those 4 years, they're at the very beginning. They end up doing, several years of fellowship and really learning their craft. And then I have another question. Do people on the panel believe? Do you believe that that the woodworking, because of the strength involved, is a field that is necessarily restricted to men?
Clearly not.
Most
students in furniture conservation are now women,
I can't help but notice that
good.
There's not a single female on your panel.
Yeah, but there are very skilled practitioners in the audience.
It's just a shifting generation, I think. In 10 years' time, there'll be 7 women up here.
Marco, I think you had a comment.
I wanted to add something about this point, because in Italy there was a lot of discussions about the education of new restorers, especially starting when also universities opened courses about restoration. Before, normally in Italy, the School of Conservation were opened only by the Ministry of Culture, and there were only 2 schools in the 2 main institutes of art conservation. And I can tell you what happened in Italy. The problem was that the university didn't have experience in practical work, so the students didn't have manual skill, and they didn't work, didn't had the possibility of work in the field. Instead, our students are always working. And this is connected to another point. How many restorers we need, really? because now we are discussing that the panel paintings restorers are disappearing. But there is also the opposite problem. How many restorers one country needs? How many can have work to do? When there were only the two schools I mentioned before, for example, we accept every year only 15 students. And when we had 4 years course, it means 60 in total students in the school and 15 young people looking for a work when they finished. 15 in Florence and 15 in Rome. Stop. And probably 30 young people can find a job. But thousands and thousands of students from the university will never find a job in conservation world, because I don't know in your country, but in Italy there is not so many money to pay for so much restorers.
I have a comment on this afterwards, but I think we should have the comments up there.
Up here first, and then up there. So, is this?
Hi, Linnea Saunders. I'm a conservator in private practice.
Could you hold it very close, please?
Okay. And I guess I just, in thinking about a lot of what people have been saying just recently, first of all, I'm a person who is very much interested in panel structural treatment. I work in private practice. And while I've had the opportunity during my various internships to do technical study of panel paintings, looking at panel construction, reconstructing a fragmented altarpiece based on the original construction, looking at frame construction. So obviously I have a lot of background in that, and then also through the years I've taken hand tool joinery classes, so I've done the hand skills, the basic classes in hand skills that the gentleman was talking about. I just wanted to ask that as you consider the training that you also include conservators in private practice who are slowly building up their skills and also who encounter panel paintings that maybe have far more structural problems because they are not in a museum or...
Yeah.
David, that's something that in the initial discussions of the panel painting initiative, it is a question that we addressed. One thing is a level of specialization towards that, but another was maybe to draft some kind of either document or information that's available on a website or something to give a kind of consensus among experts for the kinds of things that paintings conservators who are not specialists should know and can do on their own for the care of panels in general, so that you don't things that you can improve your knowledge about the care of panels without having to be an expert. So how to understand responsibly how to frame something, how to have it held, how to handle it, how to do very minor sort of repairs. I think that there's a great lack in the abilities of just paintings conservators for many kinds of things there, and that is an area that we hope to address.
Good. Yes.
Don Williams, on behalf of all the furniture conservators, I think I owe Claire Menzenreiter dinner tonight. But if you reflect on what we've seen the last 2 days, it has all been about the manipulation of wood and to a certain extent the manipulation of metal mechanisms. And I would say even more strongly than George was saying, leave it for me to have him come off as the moderate here, but manipulating wood is not adjunct to this enterprise, it is foundational to this enterprise. And if you don't start with that foundation, the chances of success, in my view, are at risk. When we ran our own furniture conservation training program, we interviewed students with the premise that they would have the full complement of skills as would be expected of a professional journeyman. And that foundation that basement, that floor, allowed us really the unbelievable opportunity to not have to spend virtually any laboratory time teaching hand skills because they were presumed and exercised. Instead, we spent all 3 years training the students to become skillful thinkers and problem solvers. As it turned out, our curriculum was based on the model of my third slide, and I will say with great pride, I stand behind the results of our product. It worked exceedingly well. But again, we presumed as the foundation a highly developed set of woodworking and wood manipulation skills. So there wasn't a question in there, I know.
I just wanted to add that from this needs survey that we have conducted so far, we at each institute discussed the possibility of collaboration between the conservators of paintings and furniture conservators, musical instrument conservators. And it opened up new discussions with the people. They all knew that there was somebody around the corner in the city that actually had these skills that they hadn't thought of really bringing in. So it's also a matter of really opening up for, bringing in the people. And for private practice, a number of museums without conservation departments completely rely on private practicing conservators in the area to have their collections done and looked after. So definitely we need to look for ways of extending knowledge to people that have the possibility of working relatively often on these side of activities, because you also need to exercise your skill. It's not something you do once every 5 years only. And that comes back to, will there, and that was what Marco alluded to, will there be sufficient needs for hundreds of panel paintings conservators? Definitely not. In the Danish National Gallery, where I'm head of conservation, we certainly need that expertise, but not on a daily basis. So we would need to share the expertise with some other institute in the close vicinity, and that's where we probably should gear towards creating training opportunities, postgraduate training opportunities for a certain number of specialists that could be shared between a number of institutions. With climate control, with already a lot done, there's probably not a huge need in all over the place. So we need to really find out what are the needs. Would they need one in Krakow? Would they need one in Prague? Would they need one in Copenhagen? In Copenhagen we might have one, but we might have to share that between 3 or 4 museums.
At the back there, could we take the microphone there? Yes, please speak now. Yes, thank you.
James.
Now, okay. Hi, I'm James Ham at the Buffalo Art Conservation Program, and this is a fascinating conversation that we're having. But a couple.
Could you hold the microphone close, please?
A couple points I'd like to make about early specialization. Our program is based on it's broad-based, and that we're trying to educate everybody in a somewhat equivalent manner, and specialization occurs in the second year. They have an entire year to decide their major, and really we're laying the groundwork for the graduates to educate themselves. And I think something as highly technical as panel paintings conservation has to occur either before, in some ways encouraged during, but really after, during the internship, and then after graduate education. I think it's just too involved. The second is about learning itself. It's a messy business. It's exciting, dynamic, and things happen that aren't always anticipated, i.e. mistakes get made. That, I think, is how you learn. If you don't make any mistakes, then you haven't really learned anything. You're just doing what you already knew. And we hope that there aren't large mistakes, of course, and that the process is guided. But it's finding the limits and dealing with things that happen at the limits, that's when you learn. So it's not quite as coddled and protected as it might sound. And that's what I wanted to say.
Good. Thank you very much. And at the top there.
Emma Boyce. I'm a student at the Hamilton Carr Institute. I think.
Could you hold the microphone as close as possible?
Much of what I wanted to ask has been discussed somewhat, but I wanted to make one first point to somebody down there who talked about female woodworkers. Just that my mother is a cabinet maker, so I think there is certainly the potential for us. Also, I was interested in, from the perspective of a student, the residencies and the training that you will be offering for new graduates, and how, for example, the selection process will be. I mean, I mentioned to Ian when he was still our director a couple of years ago that I would like to specialise in panel painting, structural work, and he said to me, "Well, we'll see if you're any good." And I think that's something that obviously needs to be. He wasn't that. He wasn't mean about it. But I think the point is somebody needs to, because we can't train too many people, and obviously there will be lots of. I think there will be lots of people who want to do this. There needs to be some way of selecting a selection process that, and perhaps it does need to be people who already have cabinet making skills or carpentry skills to start with. And I was wondering what you thought about that.
I think the panel paintings initiative that we're imagining is still at a very early stage. There will be all these opportunities that will come on stream in the future. We hope it can be quite a sort of agile initiative in that it can respond to the sorts of points that are being made today and the sort of points that you've just made as well. But the precise details of residencies and training schemes and so on have yet to be fully finalised. Am I right, Tom? Yeah. So, but a great point of part of the point of this discussion is so that the initiative can be shaped in a suitable way as we go forward. There's a hand up right here.
Hi, Monica Griesbach. I just wanted to speak as to my own way of having reached my specialty. Is, first of all, I don't think I could have specialized had it not been that I arrived into conservation school already having had a considerable amount of experience with woodworking skills. And also now that, I'm relatively new in the field, and one thing that, I am still acquiring experience in this. And two things that I have been confronted with is, one, what Karen mentioned, is that the possibility of gaining experience in panel painting, I was in some way forced to go into private practice because that is the only way that I was able to continue doing panel paintings. And it really put me in a difficult position of having to work independently, probably before I was prepared. And at the same time, it forced me to gain experience. And I have gained experience almost by knocking into my head and, quite frankly, being very frightened at moments. And what I rely on the most is being able to talk to the people who do have more experience than me and be able to reassure both my treatments and gain experience through a continued mentorship with the people who have more experience than me. So, I think I'm halfway between most people. So I think that's something that should be somehow included into the initiative of continued education for people who are somewhere halfway like I am.
Thank you. Mentorship is certainly a strong element of what we're imagining this initiative will look like. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Austin Nevin, Courtauld Institute of Art. I wanted to make a couple of points. First of all, returning to the bibliography of unpublished grey literature, I'm very aware that a lot of student work never makes it out of the cupboards in which it's stored, and I'm wondering, seeing that we have so many professionals and trainers here, what they would feel about sharing their student work in a more open way on a website, for instance, which I would hope the Getty could host? That's my first question. I know that it's very frustrating for students to have to repeat work and not have access to work that others have done. Second of all, I was reminded by Marco the need that we have to really work together, scientists, restorers, and art historians. And I'm a little bit worried because I think there's a lot of work which has actually been done, although some people might feel differently, in the last 15 years. And I feel that a lot of that work could be better informed by us. There are scientific institutes which develop new mobile instrumentation, portable devices, which have not been used to answer some of the questions that we could be asking. I was reminded by Alan about issues with movement and fatigue, as well as remote sensors. Well, there are handheld or almost handheld portable holography or SP systems. And I'm wondering if the initiative could perhaps drive the questions that we'd like to ask about the stability of our devices, about the stability of our treatments, as well as guiding new treatments and guiding training. I think that it's necessary that we see science as a developing field. In the next 10 years, we will see other new tools, and I would hope that in training for conservators and for scientists and for curators, we would also see that as part of the future.
I think just to respond to that last point, Austin, I agree entirely that the increasing availability of low-cost, relatively user-friendly instrumentation, particularly for remote sensing, I think will really feed into our field at the more practical level. And just at a Getty level, my colleague, or the chief scientist here, Giacomo Chiari, has been developing a low-cost SB system that you may be familiar with. And I suspect that Christina, waving her hand, can add a few more points on that. But I think we will definitely, I think the point you're making is registered and will feed into kind of future perspectives on developing research within this field. Christina, do you want to respond to that?
SB systems have been used in conservation since the 70s. There's been over 10 studies. It takes, say, 2 weeks to take the measurements and 5 years to understand the results, and I think that's been really underestimated. And in a lot of these systems that are around now, it's very simple to do it. It's very hard to understand the complexity of the results, and that has to be taken into account in all those things.
Thank you. I think I'm going to wrap up now, and I think what we should regard this as not as the end of the conversation we're having, but as the beginning. And this is something that will go on, and I hope with many of you continuing to participate over the months and years to come. We are very, very happy here at the Getty that this initiative is now rolling, that it's now going forward, that you're all a part of it. And do contribute in any way you can to the survey that Jørgen and Mikkel have talked about, or the bibliographic survey that we've heard about. Please continue to be involved in this great project. We have had a wonderful 2 days, great papers, a good discussion. I'm grateful to all of my co-panelists. Alan and I would like to thank them. We're grateful to all the speakers over the last 2 days, and grateful for the people here at the Getty who've made this conference possible. And apart from Ton and Kathy, the three people who have actually contributed most to the actual logistical arrangements here in the conference hall have been Sean Charette, Reem Baroudi, and Brian Fair, and I'd like to thank them very much. We can continue our discussions over drinks and refreshments out on the terrace just outside. I sincerely hope the California sun is still shining down on us, and thank you very much all for coming. Thank you.